The velvet curtain rose on a cold November evening in 1979, and Miloš Forman felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. He sat in the darkness of London's National Theatre, surrounded by the hushed anticipation of the preview audience, watching as an elderly man in a wheelchair was pushed onto the stage. The man began to speak, not to the other actors, but directly to the audience, his voice dripping with venom and self-loathing. "Ghosts of the future," he hissed, "I speak to you from the past." This was Antonio Salieri, court composer to Emperor Joseph II, and he was about to confess to murder. Forman leaned forward in his seat. The Czech-born director, who had fled his homeland after the Soviet invasion of 1968 and rebuilt his career in America, had seen thousands of plays and films. He had directed Jack Nicholson to an Oscar in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest just 4 years earlier. He knew storytelling. He knew drama. But what unfolded before him that night was something else entirely. A theatrical experience so electric, so viscerally powerful, that he could barely sit still. Peter Shaffer's Amadeus was not a conventional biographical drama. It was a fever dream, a fantasia, a meditation on genius and mediocrity wrapped in the trappings of 18th century Vienna. At its heart was a devastating question. What does it mean to recognize divine genius in another person when you yourself possess only talent? What does it do to a man's soul to know that God has chosen to speak through a vulgar, giggling child man rather than through him, the devout, the disciplined, the deserving? As the play progressed, Forman watched the actor playing Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart prance across the stage, his laugh a braying, infectious cackle that seemed designed to irritate. This Mozart was no marble statue, no powdered wig cliché from a dusty history book. He was alive, obscene, brilliant, impossible, and utterly magnetic. And opposite him, Salieri burned with a jealousy so pure, so all-consuming, that it transformed into something almost holy in its intensity. When the lights came up for intermission, Forman remained in his seat, his mind racing. He barely registered the chatter of the audience around him, the rustle of programs, the shuffle toward the bar. All he could think was, "This must be a film. This must be my film." The second act only confirmed his conviction. By the time Salieri wheeled himself off stage, having confessed his sins to the ghosts of the future, having claimed responsibility for Mozart's death through a campaign of psychological torture, Forman knew he had witnessed something extraordinary. The play had won the Evening Standard Drama Award, and it would go on to conquer Broadway, winning the 1981 Tony Award for Best Play, with Ian McKellen taking home the trophy for his searing portrayal of Salieri. But Forman could already see beyond the stage, beyond the limitations of theater. He could see Prague. He could see the Estates Theater where Mozart himself had premiered Don Giovanni 2 centuries earlier. He could see a film that would make audiences around the world fall in love with classical music, that would make them weep for both the genius and the man who envied him. There was only one problem: convincing anyone else that this vision was possible. Peter Shaffer had not set out to write a play about Mozart. The idea had germinated slowly, over years, fed by his fascination with the relationship between talent and genius, between the artist and God. The seed had been planted by Alexander Pushkin's 1830 verse drama, Mozart and Salieri, a brief but potent work that suggested the Italian composer had poisoned his Austrian rival out of envy. Pushkin's work was itself based on a rumor that had circulated through Vienna in the years following Mozart's death in 1791, a whisper that the young genius had not died of natural causes, but had been murdered by a jealous contemporary. The rumor was almost certainly false. Modern scholarship has debunked the poisoning theory thoroughly, attributing Mozart's death to any number of more prosaic causes: rheumatic fever, kidney disease, trichinosis from undercooked pork. But Shaffer wasn't interested in documentary truth. He was interested in emotional truth, in the kind of truth that could only be accessed through fiction. "I was concerned with the destructive effects of envy," Shaffer would later explain. "The idea of a man who has dedicated his life to God through music, who has been chaste and pious and disciplined, and then God, as a kind of cosmic joke, gives the gift of divine music to this creature who is in every way unworthy of it. That seemed to me a profoundly dramatic situation. Schaeffer spent years researching, reading Mozart's letters, which revealed a man who delighted in scatological humor and sexual innuendo, studying Salieri's compositions, which were competent but rarely inspired, and imagining the psychological landscape of 18th century Vienna. He created a Salieri who was not simply jealous, but theologically tormented. He created a Mozart who was simultaneously a divine vessel and an overgrown child, whose music transcended the earthly realm even as his behavior remained firmly rooted in the gutter. The play that emerged was a masterpiece of theatrical construction. Schaeffer used Salieri as narrator, allowing him to address the audience directly, to pull them into his conspiracy, to make them complicit in his envy. The structure was bold, the language was rich, and the emotional impact was devastating. When Amadeus opened at the National Theatre in November 1979, it was immediately recognized as something special. Critics raved, audiences wept. The play transferred to Broadway in 1980, where it would run for 1,181 performances and cement its place in theatrical history. But even as the play triumphed on stage, Schaeffer and his collaborators understood that they had created something with cinematic potential. The question was, who would be brave enough, or crazy enough, to try to film it? Saul Zaentz was not a man who scared easily. The producer had built his career on taking risks that other people thought were insane. In 1975, he had produced One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, adapted from Ken Kesey's novel, with Miloš Forman directing. The film had been a critical and commercial triumph, winning 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor for Jack Nicholson. Zaentz and Forman had proven they could work together, that they shared a sensibility, that they were willing to fight for their vision even when the odds seemed impossible. So when Forman came to Zaentz in 1980 with the idea of adapting Amadeus for the screen, the producer listened. He listened as Forman described the play he had seen in London, the way it had moved him, the way he could already see it as a film. He listened as Forman explained his vision, to shoot in Prague, to create something that was both historically evocative and emotionally true. And then Zaentz said yes. It was July 1981 when they made it official. Zaentz would finance the film through his company, the Saul Zaentz Company, which would produce in association with Orion Pictures. They would need Peter Schaeffer to adapt his own play, of course. No one else could be trusted with that task. And they would need time. This was not a project to be rushed. On February 1st, 1982, Peter Schaeffer arrived at Miloš Forman's farmhouse in Connecticut, carrying a suitcase and a portable typewriter. The plan was simple. Schaeffer would live there, in seclusion, for as long as it took to transform his stage play into a screenplay. Forman would be available for consultation, for discussion, for the kind of intense creative collaboration that could only happen when two artists were willing to lock themselves away from the world and focus entirely on the work. For 4 months, Schaeffer wrote. He wrote in the mornings, filling page after page with dialogue and stage directions. He wrote in the afternoons, revising and refining. He wrote in the evenings, reading scenes aloud to Forman, listening to the director's feedback, arguing about character motivations and narrative structure. The two men were both perfectionists, both uncompromising in their artistic standards, and their collaboration was sometimes contentious. But it was also profoundly productive. The challenge was significant. A stage play and a screenplay are fundamentally different forms. On stage, everything is compressed, stylized, theatrical. The audience accepts conventions that would seem absurd on film. Characters addressing the audience directly, time jumping forward and backward, sets that are clearly artificial. But film demands a different kind of realism, a different kind of intimacy. The camera can go anywhere, can show anything, can capture details that would be invisible from the back row of a theater. Schaeffer and Forman had to figure out how to open up the play without losing its theatrical power. They had to decide which scenes could be expanded, which could be cut, which needed to be completely reimagined for the screen. They had to find ways to make Salieri's narration work cinematically, to maintain his role as our guide through the story without making the film feel stagey or artificial. One of their key decisions was to expand the roles of both composers, to give them more dimension, more complexity. On stage, Mozart had been a brilliant sketch, all manic energy and inappropriate laughter. On screen, he needed to be a fully realized human being, someone the audience could love and pity and mourn. Similarly, Salieri needed to be more than just a villain. He needed to be sympathetic, even as he plotted Mozart's destruction. The audience needed to understand his pain, his sense of cosmic injustice, his desperate need to matter in a world that had already forgotten him. Schaffer and Forman were also clear from the beginning that they were not making a documentary. This was not going to be a faithful biographical portrait of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Antonio Salieri. This was going to be, in Schaffer's words, a fantasia on the theme of Mozart and Salieri, a work of imagination that used historical figures as the basis for a meditation on genius, envy, and the nature of artistic creation. "We were always open about this," Forman would later say. "We were creating entertaining drama only loosely based on reality. Anyone who wanted a history lesson should go read a book. We were making a film about ideas, about emotions, about what it means to be human." By June 1982, Schaffer had completed a draft of the screenplay. It was long, very long, running well over 3 hours. But it was also brilliant, a genuine adaptation rather than a mere transcription of the play. Forman was thrilled. Zantz was thrilled. Now all they had to do was convince a major studio to finance it. That turned out to be the hardest part of all. The pitch meetings were disasters. Forman and Zantz went from studio to studio, presenting their vision for Amadeus, and were met with polite skepticism at best, outright hostility at worst. This was 1982, the era of MTV and ET and Rocky III. The studios wanted blockbusters, franchises, films that could be marketed to teenagers. They did not want a 3-hour period drama about classical music with long German names and powdered wigs. "Who's going to see this?" one executive asked bluntly. "It's about dead composers. There's no action. There's no romance. It's just people in costumes talking about music." "The music is the action," Forman replied, but he could see he was losing the room. Another executive pointed out that the film would be expensive. Shooting in Europe, period costumes, elaborate sets, a full orchestra, the budget would be substantial. And for what? A film that would appeal to a tiny niche audience of classical music lovers and theater buffs? "This is the MTV era," the executive said, as if explaining something to a child. "Kids don't have the attention span for this kind of thing. They want music videos, not opera." Forman felt his frustration mounting. How could he make them understand? How could he convey the power of Schaffer's story, the universality of its themes? This wasn't just a film about Mozart. It was a film about anyone who had ever felt inadequate, anyone who had ever watched someone else succeed effortlessly while they struggled. It was about the unfairness of talent, the mystery of genius, the rage of being ordinary in a world that worships the extraordinary. But the studios didn't see it. One by one, they passed. Zantz, however, was undeterred. He had believed in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when everyone else thought it was uncommercial, and he had been proven right. He believed in Amadeus with the same fierce conviction. If the major studios wouldn't finance it, he would find another way. He would use his own money. He would find independent investors. He would make this film happen through sheer force of will. Orion Pictures, a smaller studio that had been founded by former United Artists executives, agreed to distribute the film. They wouldn't provide the full financing, but they would handle the release, the marketing, the theatrical distribution. It was enough. Zantz committed his own resources, and the project moved forward. Now came the truly difficult decisions: casting. The conventional wisdom in Hollywood was simple. If you wanted a film to succeed, you cast stars. Big names, recognizable faces, actors who could open a movie on the strength of their celebrity alone. But Forman had never been conventional. He had cast an unknown Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Well, relatively unknown. Nicholson had been working steadily but wasn't yet a superstar, and he had filled the supporting roles with actual psychiatric patients. For Amadeus, he wanted to do something even more radical. He wanted to cast the best actors for the roles, regardless of their fame or box office appeal. This was a brave decision, perhaps even a reckless one. But Forman believed that star power would distract from the story. If audiences saw a famous face, they would think about that actor's other roles, their public persona, their celebrity gossip. They wouldn't be able to lose themselves in 18th century Vienna. They wouldn't be able to believe in Mozart and Salieri as real people. Still, that didn't stop famous actors from lobbying for the roles. The part of Salieri, in particular, attracted interest from some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Al Pacino wanted it. Mick Jagger wanted it. Burt Reynolds wanted it. Donald Sutherland wanted it. Every English-speaking actor of a certain age, it seemed, wanted to play the tortured Italian composer who had been given the gift of recognizing genius without possessing it himself. Forman met with many of them. He listened to their pitches, watched their auditions, considered their interpretations. But he kept coming back to the same conclusion. They were all too famous, too recognizable, too much themselves. He needed someone who could disappear into the role, someone who could make audiences forget they were watching an actor at all. F. Murray Abraham was not a household name. At 45, he had been working steadily in theater and film for decades, but always in supporting roles, always as a character actor rather than a leading man. He had appeared in Serpico and All the President's Men, but in small parts that most audiences wouldn't remember. He was talented, certainly. Anyone who had seen him on stage knew that. But he was not a star. When Abraham auditioned for Salieri, Forman saw something that had been missing from all the other auditions: hunger. Abraham wanted this role with a desperation that was almost painful to witness. He understood Salieri's envy because he had lived it. He had spent his entire career watching other actors, less talented actors in his opinion, get the roles he wanted, the recognition he deserved. He knew what it felt like to be good but not great, to be talented but not touched by genius. "I am Salieri," Abraham told Forman during one of their meetings. It wasn't a boast, it was a confession. Forman cast him on the spot. The role of Mozart was, if anything, even more challenging to cast. The actor needed to be young enough to be believable as a man who died at 35, but mature enough to handle the complexity of the role. He needed to be able to play comedy and tragedy, often in the same scene. He needed to be able to make Mozart's vulgar behavior charming rather than merely obnoxious. And he needed to be musical enough to convincingly mime playing the piano and conducting an orchestra. The list of actors who auditioned or were considered for the role reads like a who's who of 1980s talent: David Bowie, Mikhail Baryshnikov, and Kenneth Branagh. Mark Hamill, who had replaced Tim Curry in the Broadway production of the play, auditioned with high hopes. But Forman felt that audiences would never be able to see past Luke Skywalker. No matter how good Hamill's performance, people would be thinking about Star Wars. Tom Hulce was invited to what Forman called a get-acquainted session in late 1982. The young actor had appeared in National Lampoon's Animal House and had done some theater work, but he was far from famous. He was, however, perfect. He had Mozart's impish energy, his manic enthusiasm, his ability to shift from childish glee to profound seriousness in an instant. When Hulce laughed, that distinctive, braying laugh that would become one of the film's most memorable elements, Forman knew he had found his Mozart. For the role of Constanza, Mozart's wife, Forman cast Meg Tilly, a young actress who had appeared in The Big Chill. Tilly was perfect for the part. Beautiful, earthy, capable of conveying both Constanza's love for her husband and her frustration with his irresponsibility. Everything was set. The cast was assembled. Filming was scheduled to begin in Prague. And then, the day before shooting was set to start, disaster struck. Meg Tilly tore a ligament playing soccer. She was out. The production was about to begin. Hundreds of people were already in Prague. Sets had been built. Costumes had been made. And suddenly, they had no Constanza. Forman went into crisis mode. He needed a replacement immediately. Someone who could step into the role with virtually no preparation. Someone who could match Holz's energy and hold her own against Abraham's intensity. He thought of Elizabeth Berridge, another young actress he had considered earlier in the casting process. Berridge was in New York. Forman called her, explained the situation, and asked if she could be on a plane to Prague within 24 hours. Berridge said yes. She arrived in Prague jet-lagged and terrified, with barely enough time to try on her costumes before being thrown into her first scene. But she was a professional, and she was determined not to let the production down. Within days, it was as if she had always been part of the cast. The chemistry between her and Holz was natural and believable. The crisis had been averted. There was one more piece of inspired casting. Simon Callow, who had played Mozart in the original London production of the play, was cast as Emanuel Schikaneder, the impresario who commissioned the magic flute. Callow brought a theatrical flamboyance to the role that was perfect for the character, and his presence created a lovely symmetry. The actor who had first brought Mozart to life on stage was now playing one of Mozart's closest collaborators on screen. The cast was complete. Now came the truly daunting part, returning to Czechoslovakia. For Miloš Forman, the decision to film Amadeus in Prague was both artistic and deeply personal. Artistically, it made perfect sense. Prague had preserved its 18th century architecture in a way that few other European cities had. The Estates Theatre, where Mozart himself had premiered Don Giovanni in 1787, was still standing, still functioning, still beautiful. The streets and squares of Prague's Old Town looked much as they had in Mozart's time. To film anywhere else would have required expensive and elaborate set construction. In Prague, the sets already existed. But personally, the decision was fraught with emotion. Forman had fled Czechoslovakia in 1968. He had left behind his homeland, his language, his culture. He had rebuilt his life in America, had become an American citizen, had made American films. But he had never stopped thinking about Prague, never stopped missing it, never stopped feeling the ache of exile. Now, 14 years later, he was going back. Not as a refugee, not as a dissident, but as a successful Hollywood director with a major film production. The communist government, which had once considered him a traitor, was now welcoming him with open arms. They wanted the prestige of hosting an American film production. They wanted the hard currency that the production would bring. They were willing to overlook Forman's past, at least temporarily, in exchange for the economic and cultural benefits of having Amadeus filmed in Prague. But Forman knew it wouldn't be easy. The secret police would be watching. Every member of the crew would be vetted. Every location would be monitored. He would have to be careful, diplomatic, willing to navigate the complex politics of filming in a communist country during the Cold War. When Forman arrived in Prague in early 1983, he was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. The city was both familiar and strange, both home and foreign territory. The streets he had walked as a young man were still there, but they felt different, darker, more oppressive under communist rule. The people he had known were older, more cautious, more worn down by decades of totalitarian control. But the city was also beautiful, heartbreakingly beautiful. The spires and domes, the cobblestone streets, the river winding through the center of the city, all of it was exactly as he remembered. And the Estates Theatre, when he first walked through its doors, took his breath away. This was where Mozart had stood, where he had conducted, where he had heard his music performed for the first time. To film here was not just an artistic choice, it was a kind of pilgrimage. Forman knew he would have to put his personal emotions aside. He was here to make a film, not to indulge in nostalgia or to settle old scores with the regime. He would have to be professional, focused, and disciplined. But late at night, alone in his hotel room, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his return. He was home, even if home was no longer quite what it had been. The Estates Theatre was a miracle and a nightmare. Built in the 1780s, it was one of the few theaters in Europe that had survived largely unchanged from the 18th century. Its acoustics were perfect, its proportions were elegant, and its historical significance was immeasurable. But it was also made almost entirely of wood, and it was a fire trap. Forman needed to film opera scenes in the theater, complete with candles, torches, and elaborate lighting effects. The risk of fire was enormous. One spark, one moment of carelessness, and the entire building could go up in flames, taking with it not just the production, but an irreplaceable piece of cultural history. The solution was to have 30 to 40 firemen on standby every single day of filming. They stood in the wings, out of camera range, with fire extinguishers and hoses at the ready. They watched every candle, every torch, every light. The tension was constant. Everyone on set was acutely aware that they were working in a tinderbox. Choreographer Twyla Tharp, who had been brought in to stage the opera sequences, would later recall the surreal experience of watching dancers whip torches around while flames flickered in the chandelier overhead. "It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time," she said. "You couldn't help but think about what would happen if something went wrong. But Miloš was fearless. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he was willing to take the risks necessary to get it." The opera scenes were among the most complex in the film. Forman wanted them to feel authentic, to capture the energy and excitement of 18th century opera, while also making them accessible to modern audiences. He worked closely with Tharp to choreograph elaborate dance sequences, with the costume designers to create hundreds of period-accurate costumes, with the lighting crew to achieve the warm, flickering glow of candlelight. The cast of extras numbered in the hundreds. Many of them were Czech citizens who had never been in a film before. They had to be trained in the conventions of 18th century behavior, taught how to move in period costumes, coached on how to react to the opera performances. It was a massive undertaking, requiring patience and precision from everyone involved. Beyond the Estates Theatre, the production filmed at locations throughout Prague. The Barrandov Studios, which had been one of the major film production centers in Europe before the war, provided sound stages for interior scenes. The Invalidovna building, a Baroque complex that had once been a military hospital, stood in for the palace where Salieri worked. Kramnierzyce Castle, located outside Prague, provided the setting for several key scenes. The 7 months of shooting, which lasted until July 1983, were grueling. The cast and crew worked long hours in difficult conditions. The weather was unpredictable. The communist bureaucracy was frustrating, requiring endless permits and approvals for even simple tasks. And the cultural divide between the American production team and the Czech crew sometimes led to misunderstandings and tensions. But there was also a sense of shared purpose, a feeling that everyone involved was working on something special. The Czech crew members, many of whom had been working in the film industry for decades under communist restrictions, were energized by the opportunity to work on an international production with Hollywood-level resources. The American cast and crew, meanwhile, were fascinated by Prague, by its history, by the strange experience of working in a communist country during the Cold War. Tom Hulce threw himself into the role with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had been practicing the piano for months before filming began, working 3 to 4 hours a day to develop the muscle memory and finger dexterity necessary to convincingly mime Mozart's keyboard performances. Over Christmas, before filming started, he had stayed alone at the London flat of conductor Sir Neville Marriner and his wife, practicing obsessively, barely leaving the apartment. "I needed to actually do it," Hulse would later explain. "Even though the keyboards on camera were silent, even though the music was being played by someone else, I needed to know that I could actually play these pieces. Otherwise, it would have felt like a lie." The Requiem dictation scene, one of the film's most powerful sequences, required extraordinary precision from both Hulse and Abraham. In the scene, a dying Mozart dictates the notes of his Requiem Mass to Salieri, who struggles to keep up with the flood of musical ideas pouring from the composer's fevered mind. Forman used 2 cameras to capture the overlapping dialogue, the sense of urgency and desperation. Hulse deliberately skipped lines, jumped ahead in the score, confused Abraham, all to achieve the impression that Salieri, despite his musical training, couldn't fully comprehend the genius unfolding before him. "It was exhausting," Abraham recalled. "Tom was so committed, so intense, that I had to match his energy. And Miloš kept pushing us, kept demanding more, kept insisting that we go deeper. By the end of that scene, we were both completely drained." F. Murray Abraham approached the role of Salieri with a different kind of intensity. He understood that Salieri was the heart of the film, the character through whose eyes we experience the story. He had to make Salieri sympathetic even as he plotted Mozart's destruction. He had to convey the character's pain, his rage, his desperate need to matter. Abraham spent hours working on Salieri's physicality, the way he moved, the way he held himself. In the framing scenes, where Salieri is an old man confessing his sins, Abraham hunched his shoulders, shuffled his feet, made himself smaller and more pathetic. In the flashback scenes, where Salieri is at the height of his career, Abraham stood taller, moved with more confidence, but always with an undercurrent of tension, of barely suppressed rage. The relationship between Hulse and Abraham on set was complex. They were playing characters who were locked in a deadly rivalry, and there was a sense in which they were competing with each other as actors as well. But there was also mutual respect, even affection. They pushed each other to be better, to dig deeper, to find new layers in their performances. Elizabeth Berridge, thrust into the production at the last minute, had to find her footing quickly. Her Constanza was earthy and practical, a woman who loved her husband but was also exasperated by his childishness and his inability to manage money. Berridge brought a warmth and humor to the role that balanced the intensity of the 2 male leads. Sir Neville Marriner was not a man to compromise. The distinguished British conductor, founder of the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, had agreed to conduct the music for Amadeus on one condition. Mozart's music would remain completely unchanged from the original scores. No arrangements, no adaptations, no concessions to modern tastes. If they were going to use Mozart's music, they were going to use it properly. Forman agreed without hesitation. He wanted authenticity, wanted audiences to hear Mozart's music as it had been written, in all its complexity and beauty. But this created challenges. Mozart's operas were long, his symphonies were intricate, his chamber music was delicate. How do you film opera scenes that feel dynamic and engaging while remaining true to the music? How do you make a 3-hour film about classical music that doesn't feel like a concert film? The solution was to treat the music as a character, as important as Mozart or Salieri. Forman and his cinematographer Miroslav Ondřiček developed a visual language for the music, using camera movement and editing to create a sense of rhythm and flow that matched the compositions. When Mozart's music played, the camera danced. When Salieri's music played, the camera was more static, more conventional. The opera sequences were particularly challenging. Forman wanted to show complete performances, or at least substantial excerpts, of The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and The Magic Flute. But he also needed to advance the story, to show the reactions of the characters, to maintain narrative momentum. The solution was to intercut the performances with shots of the audience, with close-ups of Mozart conducting, with Salieri watching from the shadows, his face a mask of envy and admiration. Mariner worked closely with the cast to ensure that their physical movements matched the music. When Holst conducted, his gestures had to be in time with the orchestra. When he mimed playing the piano, his fingers had to hit the keys at exactly the right moments. It required endless rehearsal, endless patience, endless attention to detail. The Requiem scene was the culmination of all this preparation. In the scene, Mozart, on his deathbed, dictates the notes of his final composition to Salieri.
Now the orchestra. Second bassoon and bass trombones with the basses, identical notes and rhythm. First bassoon, tenor trombones with the tenors.
Go too fast.
Do you have it?
Go too fast.
Do you have it?
The music is sublime, heartbreaking, a meditation on death and redemption. But the scene is also about the relationship between the two composers, about Salieri's realization that he is witnessing the creation of something immortal, something that will outlive both. Forman filmed the scene with two cameras running simultaneously, capturing the overlapping dialogue, the sense of urgency. Holst sang the vocal parts, hummed the instrumental lines, his voice weak and raspy. Abraham scribbled notes on the manuscript paper, his hands shaking, his face showing the strain of trying to keep up.
Listen to me.
I don't understand.
Listen. Trumpets in D, tonic and dominant, first and third beats. It goes with the harmony.
Yes, yes, yes.
Miloš wanted it to feel chaotic, Holst recalled. He wanted it to feel like Salieri was drowning in Mozart's genius, like he couldn't quite grasp what was happening. So I deliberately confused Murray, skipped ahead, changed things up. And Murray had to react in the moment, had to show Salieri's frustration and awe. The result is one of the most powerful scenes in the film, a moment where music and drama fuse into something transcendent. We see Mozart's genius in its purest form, unfiltered by social convention or physical health. And we see Salieri's tragedy. He understands enough to recognize the greatness of what he's witnessing, but not enough to create it himself. The soundtrack album, released alongside the film, would go on to sell over 6.5 million copies, introducing millions of people to Mozart's music. For many viewers, Amadeus was their first exposure to classical music, their first experience of opera. The film didn't just tell a story about Mozart, it made audiences fall in love with his music. The collaboration between Forman and Schaeffer was not always smooth. Both men were perfectionists, both were uncompromising in their artistic vision, and both were accustomed to being in control. Schaeffer was one of the most respected playwrights in the English-speaking world, a man who had won Tony Awards and Evening Standard Awards, whose plays were performed on stages around the globe. Forman was an Oscar-winning director, a man who had become one of Hollywood's most distinctive voices. When two such powerful creative forces come together, conflict is inevitable. The arguments usually centered on the adaptation itself. Schaeffer had written the play, had lived with these characters for years, had a clear sense of who they were and what they represented. But Forman was making a film, not staging a play, and he had his own ideas about how the story should be told. One major point of contention was the character of Mozart. In the play, Mozart was more of a sketch, a brilliant but somewhat one-dimensional figure whose main function was to drive Salieri to distraction. Forman wanted to give Mozart more depth, more humanity. He wanted audiences to see Mozart's vulnerability, his fear of poverty, his desperate need for approval from his father. He wanted to show the toll that genius took on Mozart, the way it isolated him, the way it made him both more and less than human. Schaeffer initially resisted. He worried that making Mozart too sympathetic would undermine Salieri's position as the protagonist. The play was Salieri's story, told from Salieri's perspective. If audiences started identifying too much with Mozart, the whole structure would collapse. But Forman was insistent. "We need to love Mozart," he argued. "We need to mourn him. Otherwise, the ending won't work. Otherwise, it's just a story about a jealous man destroying someone we don't care about." Eventually, Schaeffer came around. He wrote new scenes that showed Mozart's relationship with his father, his financial struggles, his growing desperation as his health failed. These scenes added depth and complexity to the character without undermining Salieri's centrality to the story. Another point of conflict was the ending. In the play, Salieri's confession is ambiguous. We're never quite sure whether he actually killed Mozart or whether he's simply taking credit for something that happened naturally. The play leaves the question open, allowing audiences to draw their own conclusions. Forman wanted more clarity. He wanted to show that Salieri didn't literally poison Mozart, but that his psychological campaign, his subtle undermining, his anonymous commissions, his manipulation, contributed to Mozart's decline. He wanted to show that envy can kill, even without physical violence. Again, Schaeffer initially resisted. He liked the ambiguity of the play, the way it kept audiences guessing. But Forman argued that film required a different kind of resolution, a more definitive ending. After much discussion, they found a compromise. The film would show Salieri's machinations clearly, but it would also show that Mozart's death was ultimately the result of poverty, overwork, and illness. Salieri was guilty, but not in the way he claimed. His real crime was not murder, but the sin of envy itself. These creative conflicts, while sometimes frustrating, ultimately strengthened the film. Schaeffer's theatrical instincts and Forman's cinematic vision complemented each other, creating something richer and more complex than either man could have achieved alone. The screenplay that emerged from their collaboration was both faithful to the spirit of the play and genuinely cinematic, a true adaptation rather than a mere transcription. When filming wrapped in July 1983, Forman had hundreds of hours of footage. The assembly cut of the film ran well over 4 hours. It was brilliant, but it was also exhausting. Even Forman, who loved every frame, had to admit that it was too long. The question was, what to cut? Every scene felt essential. Every moment contributed to the story, to the character development, to the emotional arc. But Forman knew that audiences had limits. A 3-hour film about classical music was already pushing the boundaries of commercial viability. A 4-hour film would be impossible to market, impossible to distribute, impossible to get people to sit through. The editing process was agonizing. Forman and his editor, Nina Danevik, spent months in the editing room, trying different cuts, different arrangements, different pacing. They cut entire scenes, trimmed others, rearranged sequences. Every decision was painful. One of the most difficult cuts was a sequence showing Mozart's relationship with his mother-in-law. The scenes were beautifully acted and added depth to Mozart's domestic life, but they slowed the narrative momentum. Forman reluctantly cut them. Another difficult decision involved the opera performances. Forman had filmed extensive excerpts from The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and The Magic Flute. He had to find a balance between showing enough to convey the music's brilliance and not showing so much that audiences became restless. The final cut of the film ran 160 minutes, 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was still long, but it felt right. The pacing was tight, the narrative was clear, and the emotional impact was devastating. Forman had achieved what he set out to do. He had made a film that was both entertaining and profound, both accessible and artistically ambitious. But he never forgot the scenes he had cut. Years later, in 2002, he would release a director's cut that restored about 20 minutes of footage. The longer version gave more depth to certain characters and relationships, but Forman always maintained that the theatrical cut was the better film. "Sometimes less is more," he said. "We made the right decision in 1984. We couldn't risk pushing the audience's patience too far." The world premiere of Amadeus took place in Los Angeles on September 6, 1984. The audience was filled with Hollywood royalty, critics, and industry insiders. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Would this gamble pay off? Would audiences embrace a 3-hour period drama about classical music? The lights dimmed. The film began. And for the next 160 minutes, the audience was transfixed. When the lights came up, there was a moment of silence. That particular kind of silence that follows a truly powerful artistic experience, when the audience needs a moment to return to reality. And then the applause began. It started slowly, then built to a thunderous ovation. People were crying, laughing, talking excitedly. The gamble had paid off. The film was released by Orion Pictures on September 19, 1984, to widespread critical acclaim. Roger Ebert, perhaps the most influential film critic in America, called it magnificent, praising its visual splendor and emotional power. Other critics echoed his enthusiasm. The New York Times called it a triumph. The Los Angeles Times called it a masterpiece. But the real test was the box office. Would audiences actually pay to see a film about Mozart? Would they sit through 3 hours of classical music and period costumes? They would. Amadeus became a surprise hit, eventually grossing over $90 million worldwide, an enormous sum for a period drama with no major stars. Audiences who had never been to an opera, who had never listened to classical music, found themselves captivated by the story, moved by the music, devastated by the tragedy. The film's success was particularly remarkable given the era in which it was released. This was 1984, the year of Ghostbusters and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and the Terminator. MTV was at the height of its influence. Music videos were the dominant form of youth culture, and attention spans were supposedly shrinking. Yet here was a 3-hour film about 18th century composers, and people couldn't get enough of it. As awards season approached, Amadeus became the film to beat. It was nominated for everything. The Golden Globes, the BAFTAs, the Directors Guild Awards, the Writers Guild Awards. In total, the film would be nominated for 53 awards and would win 40 of them. But the ultimate prize was the Academy Awards. On March 25, 1985, Amadeus received 11 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for both F. Murray Abraham and Tom Hulce, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Costume Design, Best Art Direction, Best Sound, Best Film Editing, and Best Makeup. The ceremony itself provided one of the most memorable moments in Oscar history. Laurence Olivier, the legendary British actor, was presenting the award for Best Picture. At 78 years old, Olivier was suffering from the early stages of dementia. When he opened the envelope, he looked confused. He forgot to read the list of nominees. He simply looked at the camera and announced, "The winner for this is Amadeus." There was a moment of confusion in the audience. Was that it? Was that how you announced Best Picture? But then the applause began, and Saul Zaentz and Miloš Forman made their way to the stage, grinning from ear to ear. By the end of the night, Amadeus had won 8 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, F. Murray Abraham, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Sound, and Best Makeup. It was one of the most dominant performances in Oscar history. F. Murray Abraham's win was particularly poignant. He had been nominated alongside his co-star Tom Hulce, and there had been speculation that they might split the vote, allowing another actor to win. But Abraham's performance as Salieri had been too powerful, too memorable. When his name was called, he made his way to the stage with tears in his eyes. His acceptance speech was brief but heartfelt. "There's only one thing missing for me tonight," he said, his voice breaking, "and that is to have Tom Hulce standing by my side." It was a generous gesture, an acknowledgement that his performance had been possible only because of Hulce's brilliance as Mozart. The two actors had pushed each other, challenged each other, brought out the best in each other. Abraham's Oscar belonged to both of them. Backstage, reporters asked Abraham how it felt to finally achieve recognition after decades of working in obscurity. "I feel like Salieri," he said with a wry smile. I've been waiting my whole life for this moment. The difference is, I got my moment. Salieri never did. In the years following its release, Amadeus has only grown in stature and influence. It introduced millions of people to classical music, sparked renewed interest in Mozart's life and work, and even led to a rediscovery of Salieri's compositions. Musicologists began to reassess Salieri's place in music history, recognizing that he had been a talented and influential composer in his own right, even if he wasn't a genius on Mozart's level. The film's influence extended beyond the world of classical music. It changed the way biographical films were made, demonstrating that you could take liberties with historical fact in service of emotional truth. It showed that period dramas could be commercially successful if they were well made and emotionally engaging. And it proved that audiences were willing to embrace challenging, ambitious films if they were given the chance. The soundtrack album became one of the best-selling classical music albums of all time, selling over 6.5 million copies. For many people, it was their introduction to Mozart's music, their first experience of the sublime beauty of the Marriage of Figaro or the dark power of the Requiem. Music teachers reported that enrollment in classical music classes increased dramatically in the years following the film's release. Symphony orchestras saw attendance rise. Mozart's music, which had never really gone out of fashion, experienced a full-scale renaissance. In 2002, Forman released a director's cut that restored approximately 20 minutes of footage that had been cut from the theatrical release. The additional scenes provided more context for certain characters and relationships, particularly Mozart's interactions with his father and his financial struggles. Some critics and fans preferred the longer version, arguing that it gave the story more depth and complexity. Others felt that the theatrical cut was tighter and more focused. Forman himself maintained that both versions had their merits, but that the theatrical cut was the version he had intended audiences to see in 1984. The film's reputation continued to grow over the decades. In 2019, the Library of Congress selected Amadeus for preservation in the National Film Registry, recognizing it as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The honor placed the film alongside such classics as Citizen Kane, The Godfather, and Casablanca, a testament to its enduring impact and importance. For the film's 40th anniversary in 2024, a 4K restoration was released, allowing new generations to experience the film in unprecedented clarity and detail. The restoration revealed details that had been invisible in earlier versions: the texture of the costumes, the grain of the wood in the estate's theater, the subtle expressions on the actors' faces. It was like seeing the film for the first time all over again. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Amadeus's legacy is the way it changed how we think about genius and creativity. The film asks profound questions that resonate far beyond the specific story of Mozart and Salieri. What does it mean to be talented but not great? What does it do to a person to recognize genius in someone else while knowing they will never achieve it themselves? How do we reconcile the unfairness of talent, the seeming randomness of who gets blessed with extraordinary gifts? These questions are universal. Everyone who has ever pursued a creative endeavor has felt some version of Salieri's pain. Everyone has watched someone else succeed effortlessly while they struggled. Everyone has wondered why some people seem to have been touched by divine inspiration, while others, no matter how hard they work, remain merely competent. Amadeus doesn't offer easy answers to these questions. It doesn't tell us that hard work will always be rewarded, or that talent is distributed fairly, or that everyone gets their moment of recognition. Instead, it offers something more valuable: empathy. It asks us to understand Salieri's pain, to recognize his humanity even as we condemn his actions. It asks us to see that envy is not simply a character flaw, but a natural human response to injustice, even if that injustice is cosmic rather than social. At the same time, The film celebrates genius in all its messy, complicated glory. Mozart is not a saint or a hero. He's vulgar, irresponsible, childish, and often insufferable. But when he sits at the keyboard, when he conducts an orchestra, when he composes, he becomes something more than human. He becomes a conduit for something divine, something that transcends the petty concerns of daily life. The film suggests that this is what genius is. Not a reward for virtue or hard work, but a gift that comes unbidden, that transforms its recipient into something both more and less than human. Mozart didn't earn his genius. He didn't deserve it any more than Salieri deserved his mediocrity. It simply was. And that ultimately is what makes Amadeus so powerful and so enduring. It tells a story about the unfairness of talent, the mystery of genius, and the very human response of envy. It does so with humor and pathos, with visual splendor and emotional depth. It makes us laugh at Mozart's antics and weep at his death. It makes us understand Salieri's rage and pity his fate. 40 years after its release, Amadeus remains a masterpiece, a film that works on every level, that satisfies both intellectually and emotionally, that entertains even as it provokes thought. It is, in its own way, a work of genius, created by talented people who understood that sometimes the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. Miloš Forman, who died in 2018 at the age of 86, made many films in his long career. But Amadeus was his masterpiece, the film that best expressed his artistic vision and his understanding of human nature. It was a film about genius, made by someone who understood genius from the inside, who knew what it meant to create something that would outlive its creator. Peter Schaffer, who died in 2016 at the age of 90, wrote many plays, but Amadeus was his most enduring work, the one that will be performed and studied for generations to come. It was a play about envy, written by someone who understood the creative process, who knew the pain of watching others succeed, who had felt the sting of being good but not great. F. Murray Abraham, who is still working in his 80s, has appeared in dozens of films and television shows since Amadeus. But Salieri remains his defining role, the performance that proved he was capable of greatness. It was a role about mediocrity, played by someone who was anything but mediocre. Tom Hulce, who largely retired from acting in the 1990s to focus on producing, gave the performance of a lifetime as Mozart. He made us believe in genius, made us see the divine spark that animated this vulgar, brilliant, impossible man. It was a role that required him to be both clown and tragic hero, and he succeeded brilliantly at both. And the film itself? Amadeus endures because it tells a story that matters, that speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It reminds us that genius is rare and precious, that talent is not always rewarded, that life is not fair. But it also reminds us that art endures, that beauty transcends mortality, that the music remains long after the musicians are gone. In the final scene of the film, an elderly Salieri is wheeled through the corridors of the asylum, blessing his fellow inmates as mediocrities. It's a moment of dark comedy and profound sadness. Salieri has accepted his fate. He will not be remembered. His music will be forgotten. But Mozart's music, that divine, impossible, transcendent music, will live forever. And so it has. And so too has Amadeus, a film about genius that is itself a work of genius, a meditation on mortality that has achieved a kind of immortality. 40 years after its release, it remains as powerful, as moving, as relevant as ever. It is, in every sense of the word, a masterpiece. The ghosts of the future that Salieri addressed in the opening scene of the play have become us, the audiences of the 21st century, still watching, still listening, still moved by this story of genius and envy, of music and mortality, of the divine spark that occasionally touches human beings and transforms them into something more than themselves. We are the ghosts of Salieri's future, and we have rendered our verdict. Mozart's music endures, Salieri's envy endures, and Amadeus, the play, the film, the story, endures as well, a testament to the power of art to illuminate the human condition, to make us laugh and weep, to remind us of what we are and what we might become. In the end, that is the true legacy of Amadeus. Not just a great film, but a work of art that has enriched our culture, deepened our understanding of genius and creativity, and given us a story that will be told and retold for generations to come. It is a film that matters, that endures, that continues to speak to us across the decades, and that, perhaps, is the closest thing to immortality that any artist can hope to achieve.